Hey everyone, welcome to the Chess Pupils Summer Academy. Today is week number 4, and today we're going to be looking at the endgame. So today, in addition to endgame basics, checkmate patterns, we'll also be looking at some more advanced strategies like triangulation and zugzwang, and how to play with some advanced rook endgames. So let's get started. First off, if you haven't already, make sure you grab a copy of Becoming a Chess Master: Practical Tips and Strategies. It goes a lot more beyond the video course that we have right here and also has a ton of practice positions for you to play through. It's what helped me become a chess master and is also what you need to help you on your journey to becoming a chess master. We do still have our giveaway going on. After the video, comment on this video with your favorite part of the class. 3 random winners at the end of the giveaway will get a free copy of Becoming a Chess Master. All right, so let's talk about the end game. The end game, it's the final stage of the chess game. It comes after the opening, after the middle game, and finally the end game. It occurs when most of your pieces have been exchanged. And so the possible outcomes in this situation are basically there's a few pieces left, and you can either have checkmate or stalemate, right? You don't have any of those complex advantages or anything that could happen, right? And usually there's a few general principles that we want to follow in the end game. We want to support the passed pawns, right? Pawns that have no opponent, they're going to be usually what win you in the end game, especially as you get more advanced, because those can try to promote and become queens or rooks or knights and become pieces that can actually deliver checkmate to the king. So sometimes I have beginners ask me, why should I try to be up a pawn, up a 2 pawns? That's not enough to checkmate. You're right. It's not enough to checkmate. But in the end game, it's enough to promote if you play correctly and use that to checkmate your opponent. Also, in the end game, so in the opening, we say keep the king away, safe out of the middle, and castle it away and keep it safe and tucked. We say the same for the middle game. But in the end game, depending on the pieces and the position, the king can actually be an active fighting piece that comes out. And in fact, there was a study done on this, and even though the king is technically worth an infinite number of points and can never be lost because otherwise the game's over, in terms of fighting power, the king represents about 4 points of fighting power. So that's weaker than a rook, but stronger than a minor piece. And so the king can be a very strong piece if used correctly, but you have to be careful that it doesn't get mated or in some other kind of trouble. In endgame, you usually have a small advantage because if you have a large advantage, the game ends relatively quickly. So you have a small advantage, and you have to usually use that small advantage and convert that into the win that you need. And usually that comes through that process of having that one extra pawn and using that pawn to promote and take your opponent's pieces. You want to restrict your opponent's play. Don't give your opponent too much counterplay in the end game because if you do that, they will find a way to either draw if they're losing or to win. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at some basic endgames. We're going to look at king and pawn endgames, which are very common. That's when all the pieces have been traded and all you have left are the kings and a few pawns. And so there are some very famous positions that you should look at, especially because when you're playing as a beginner, if your opponent hasn't blundered any pieces and you haven't blundered any pieces, many times many of the pieces will trade off and someone's going to find themselves either up a pawn or having a passed pawn. And so there's a few different things that we'll look at when we're looking at that scenario. Now remember, endgames, they're the perhaps most clear part of the game because there's the least pieces, but that doesn't make them any easier than the other parts. If anything, there's a lot more calculation involved here because there are less chances of you being able to fix a mistake because there's less pieces left on the board. Even one tiny misstep, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a losing position. So for king and pawn endgames, we're going to be looking at the rule of the square, opposition, outflanking, and shouldering. We also have some slides on the rook and pawn endgames. Specifically, there's 2 famous ones, which are the Lucena position and the Philidor position. Both of these we're going to be doing towards the end of the class, depending on the time that we have with the rest of our content. We also have other pieces in pawn endgames. So, for example, bishop color versus promotion squares, bishops versus knight. How do we play all those different endgames? And we'll take a brief look at everything. So on this board at the top, you can see that we have right here this pawn endgame, and this is actually a very famous endgame. Now, this right here is a different type of endgame where white is up a bishop, right? So white is clearly winning, but actually there is potential for black to draw in this position. It's very tricky for black to draw, but black can find a way to draw because this bishop doesn't have the same color as this promoting square. And so there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. I'm just trying to provide a general idea that happens. But let's look at some specifics. So when we're talking about king and pawn endgames, something we briefly looked at last class was the rule of the square. And the rule of the square states that essentially when you're trying to promote, right, which can essentially many times decide whether you win the game or not, because 1 point, one pawn might not be enough, but if it becomes a queen and now you're up 9 points, all of a sudden that's more than enough. The rule of the square states that you can see if a king can stop a pawn. So in this position, even though white is up a pawn, black hasn't lost all hope yet because black can see, can it stop this pawn from promoting? And if it can, even though white's up a pawn, that's not enough to win unless it promotes. And so what is this rule of the square? Take this pawn and draw a diagonal line through it until you get to the end of the chessboard. And if this was a pawn in the center of the board, you could do it on both sides. And then what you have to do is you have this diagonal, draw the corresponding square that is represented by it. And within this square, if the black king can step within this square by the end of its turn, it can stop the pawn. It can stop the pawn from reaching the end. If not, the pawn is too fast. So in this case, if it was white to move, we would move here, move our pawn forward, and all of a sudden our square would be too small for the black king to be able to jump into because it would take at least 2 moves, but they only get 1 move. Versus if it was black to move right now, black could move the king into the square, and then even though we're up a pawn, it would be a draw. And so what I mean by that is in this case, it's white to move. White just pushes, and notice that we have this square right here. And so even if we try to chase it, the square gets too small. And now you can see why the square matters, right? If you're in the square, you would be able to capture, but we are not, and white would win. But let's say white wastes a move. Now in the square, black can come in. And so now if black tries anything, we actually, if white tries anything, we can actually stop it by pushing, pushing, pushing. And then finally, here you think white might get away. But since we can get in the square, we come here and there's no promotion because we'll just capture it. Okay. Now, the rule of the square, very quick way of doing calculation in your head when you don't know if you can catch a pawn or not. Okay, so what is this next concept of opposition? So opposition, perhaps one of the most easiest concepts in chess for beginners, but then also the most hardest concepts in chess. So it's ambiguous as to there can be very easy positions with opposition. And I mean, obviously there's a baseline level of difficulty when we're talking about opposition, but also they can be very difficult when we're talking about opposition. So opposition exists in these king and pawn endgames where there's no other pieces. What ends up happening is when you have just pawns and kings, once a pawn moves, it can never move a square back. And so that means making a pawn move is very committal, right? In that last position, we saw that moving that pawn forward means that the black king can now capture it. And so if you move your king in certain ways, you sometimes have to force your opponent's king to either move out of the way or you get in your opponent's way so that they can't force you out of the way so that you can actually promote your pawn, right? So for example, in this position right here, black's king is just in front of the pawn, right? And so even if white had all the moves in the world, it can't just keep on moving this pawn forward because eventually it just gets blocked by this king, and pawns can only move one way forward, right? And so we need to find a way to fix that. So direct opposition is this idea that two kings face each other. And when these two kings face each other, they're either in the same rank or in the same file, and there's one square in between them. Distant opposition is the idea that you have the same square or rank or file thing, but now you might have 3 or 5 squares between the kings. And so the reason it's still opposition is if For example, the black king moves forward, you just mirror them, white king moves forward, and now it's normal direct opposition. So distant opposition can lead to direct opposition. Not always, there are some caveats to that, but in general, distant opposition is very valuable because it can lead to direct opposition. So why does opposition matter? If you gain opposition with the king, the opponent's king has no way to move forward because all three squares in front of it are blocked. And so either needs to move to the side or it needs to move backwards. And in either case, usually you're making some sort of a gain in the position, which makes it meaningful for you to do that. Okay. Um, Once you have that, you can see where how strong this idea is. So that when white's king moves here, for example, now black's king actually has to move out of the way. And if it moves here, we move our king there, prevent the king from coming back to c7, and then promote, right? Of course, there's a few more moves there, but that's a general idea. And so when you play a move that causes opposition, you either force your opponent to move away, which you can shoulder them after that, which we'll look at shouldering in a second, or you can block their pawn or create a draw, and they have no way to get around that. Let's look at a few examples. Let's say we played this move. We gain opposition. Now, if we didn't do that, if we played something like this, they would just come here and there's no actual way for us to promote, right? We need to move their king out of the way. Now, obviously, we're blocking our own pawn, so now we come here. Notice all of a sudden, we stop them from coming to the c7 square, which allows us to, now push our pawn. So now we push our pawn again. Okay, but the problem now is, in this king and pawn endgame, if you push the pawn right now, they'll give you opposition. And so then regardless of what you do, let's say you push it again, they'll come back. And then either you move your king away from your pawn and stop defending it, or if you move your king here to give them opposition this time, it's now actually stalemate. And so in this position, the only correct move is you first have to give opposition. Once they move out of the way, you go here with the king, and now their king can't come in front of the pawn, and you're defending all those squares. And so now we just easily promote. And so that's how we would play a position like this. The reverse also works. In this position, we need to hold the draw as white, and even though we're down a pawn, we get the opposition by moving our king directly opposite the black king. Now, whatever the black king does, we just copy him. And now you might say, wait, now black has the opposition because they just wasted a move, right? But we just go back. Now, this is a crucial junction. If we move here, they'll come here, and then next move come here and promote to queen, right? So our three choices are this square, and this square. If we play this square, they'll give us direct opposition. And then if we go here, they'll push. And then we're forced to move out of that position. So actually we have to go back because then they can't give us direct opposition because the black king can't obviously move where that e6 or e3 pawn is. And so we go here. And now if they push, obviously we'll take. But regardless of what they did, we would be better in that case. Let's look at one example of distant opposition. Here, if we try to get closer to their king, they just get opposition. So the idea is to get distant opposition. Now we come here, and now we just take the pawn. All right, so that is the idea of opposition. Let's look at a few other piece and pawn endgames. Let's start by looking at the bishop and pawn endgame. In the bishop and pawn endgame, that can be a draw. Usually it's a win, right? You're up a whole 4 points. But if the pawn is in the rook file, so in the edge files, right? So either on the A file or the H file, and your bishop is not the same color as the square it would promote on. So in this case, it would be a black square it promotes on. If your opponent's king can move to that promotion square, once it's there, there's actually no way to move it out of that corner area for the white pawn to advance. Now, the reason this only happens in the rook files is because in the other ways, you could use ideas of opposition and force them to get out the other way. But in this case, as soon as you start closing in, since black will run out of moves and can't escape from the other side because there's no other side of that chessboard, it will be stalemate, and so it'll be a draw. And so that's why rook pawns usually can lead to many different types of draws. On the other hand, we have bishops versus knight. The bishop, very much better usually in almost every situation in the endgame. There is a caveat to that. The knight is much better in closed positions. And because the knight is much better in closed positions, um, usually if you have the side with the knight, you want to keep the position closed and then utilize the knight. For example, here's an extreme position where even though black is down a pawn, right, because white has 5 pawns and black has 4 pawns, um, this black pawn right here, or this knight right here, actually stops any of white's pieces to move. This bishop right here is just stuck in enemy lines or in its own lines by its own pawns, so they can't move out of the way. And this king right here is also stuck as it can only go to c1 or e1 and can never escape. All right. So this is an example of when the bishop is better. Notice how this is an extreme example of white having 5 pawns versus 1 pawn for the black side. But regardless of even if it's white to move, this black bishop actually stops all the pawns. And if the knight is bad enough, it comes out, we push, and regardless of what we do, we actually just check the next move. The knight is too slow to even come to this side. We could also have a knight that's better in this position. The king goes to c1. We don't actually even have to do much. We just maneuver a bit. We give opposition, right? Remember this idea of opposition. If you move the knight out of the way, nothing happens really. But if you give opposition, now you can come here and now the bishop would either waste its time a bit, and now we can take this pawn. And all of a sudden, we now have a passed pawn that we can play with. And so we would see just like that, we've checkmated our opponent. All right. So now let's look at some very common checkmate patterns. We're going to look at the back rank checkmate, which is perhaps one of the most common checkmates. And it's this idea of a rook or queen taking advantage of a trapped king. And in trapped, I mean that, and sometimes this happens in the end game, sometimes in the middle game, and frequently in beginner games, where the king is trapped behind its own pawns and that block it from having any escape square. And because of that, a rook or queen on that last rank actually give it checkmate. We'll also look at the ladder checkmate, which involves 2 heavy pieces, moves the pieces down the board, just like how ladder rungs do, until the king is checkmated. This involves usually 2 rooks or a rook and a queen, so it tends to be much easier than the other checkmates. Now, if you only had 1 heavy piece, let's say only a queen, the checkmate is still easy, and we'll look at a strategy to do that. And so that tells you how to slowly back the enemy king into a corner. The big thing here is you want to avoid stalemate because the queen is such a powerful piece. Um, it's powerful enough to stalemate the king on its own. It is not powerful enough to give checkmate on its own. So you also have to know how to use the king. And we'll also look at less commonly the rook and king checkmate, which is to slowly back this enemy king into a corner or edge. And that gets very hard because you only have a rook, but you have to use your king very carefully to force this checkmate. And so a lot of these advantages are very common. Many times you've been up a rook or queen, but you might be wondering, like, how do I actually give the checkmate now? And this will help us figure that out. Okay. So let's start by looking at the back rank checkmate. So the back rank checkmate, one of the most common checkmates in chess, it occurs when there's this enemy king, which is in the original spot after this kingside castle. And it has these 3 pawns in front of it that have not been moved. By the way, there's a advice in chess called a luft, and a luft is basically when you move one of these pawns up here, and the reason you move one of those pawns is so that your king has an escape square for any back rank checkmate. But the idea is that kings has been walled in by its own pawns, and what we do is we do a back rank checkmate where we move our queen to that last rank, take the rook, their rook captures. So let's look at this starting now. We move the queen to the last square, their rook captures, our rook captures, and it's mate because the king is in check and it can't escape because of its own pawns. You need a heavy piece to do a back rank checkmate, and it can be horizontal or vertical. And usually, of course, it's horizontal when you have a back rank checkmate, especially in the middle game, because obviously your opponent is just castled. In that game, sometimes there are vertical back ranks. Perhaps one of my favorite checkmates, the ladder checkmate, also called the lawnmower checkmate. And it's a forced checkmate when you have two heavy pieces, so like a rook and a queen, or a queen and a queen, and it uses both the enemy pieces together or both the heavy pieces together in conjunction to push the enemy king to one edge of the board. One prevents this king from moving back while the other's checking, and with the two rooks, it basically stops your king from coming back and just checkmating you whenever or just escaping your trap whenever you have only one rook. Now, the big thing here is we'll look at how to give this checkmate with just one rook and the king, but when you have two heavy pieces, it becomes a much easier to do this checkmate. All right, so let's start by looking at a few of these mates. The first mate we had was this queen and rook checkmate. So with this, like we said, we create a lawnmower, we move our queen here, and we've trapped in the king. Now, instead of giving check with the queen again, the king will only escape. So now we use our other piece and move it here. And now the key thing is this one piece stops the king from coming back out, and this one checks it and stops it from coming in this row. And so now it goes in the corner. And now I would have the rooks trapping here, so I would move my queen to give check. But obviously I can't move my queen to give check just yet, because if I do that here, they'll capture or here. And so now many times what you need to do is you need to move the queen or the rook to the other side so that your king has nothing to capture or worry about. And they move there, and now you do this. Finally, you have your queen stopping this square. So finally you get your rook, and you have that checkmate. Let's try with two rooks. We move our rook here. They move their king over, same as last time. Move the other rook to check. And now we can't go here or here. Well, this is not a queen, this is a rook, so we can't even go to c7. But now we just move to the other side, and we just have to spend that one move moving to the other side. And once we've done that, we can still give this same exact checkmate. Okay, now let's look at how to give checkmate with the queen and the king. So when you have the queen and the king checkmate, you push your opponent's king to edge of the board. And the way you do this is you move your queen to a square that is a knight's jump distance away from the king. So you always stay in this L shape with the queen. By the way, there's many different ways to give this checkmate. I'm trying to give you a formula so that you can always do it the same way. And you keep on doing this until the king is in the corner, and then do not put the king, queen, and knights jump away. Sometimes students, I say, move in the L shape, and then they just keep on doing that, even when the king's in the corner. If the king's in the corner and you move it just two squares away, it'll be stalemate. So once you're there, then move the king over and use that to give checkmate. And we can see that being seen in this GIF on the right side. Okay. Finally, we keep our queen stationary so that the king can come in, and then the king finally gives the checkmate. So let's look at an example of this. First, I might not always be able to get the queen in the L shape in one move. I'll just give some sort of a check to get my queen out. And now I can give my queen in an L shape. So basically, you're following what the king does. King goes up. Remember, if, for example, you can't do it if your king is in the way, just move your king out of the way, right? There's no rush. Um, you just move whatever piece is hindering it and then just keep the strategy going. Queen to c4. Okay, king comes here. Now, usually you might be like, hey, can I give check here, move the king back? Yeah, you could do whatever you want, but we're trying to come up with a general strategy. Keep on giving this L shape, L, right? King goes forward. We have this two squares and L. We follow them. Keep on doing this. Keep on doing this. Notice how slowly we're closing the king off. And now at this point, I do this. And now they've moved here. I do not do it one more time because that would be stalemate. And so now I just simply bring my king over. Once I have my king over, I can use the king to defend the queen and deliver checkmate. Let's do that one more time. This time I'm going to move the queen to a different square. Come here, check here, and finally we're in this idea of the L shape. And finally the king is trapped. We move our king over. Same idea, different part of the chessboard. And there are many different ways to give mate here. You can move here, or you could do it like this. That position at the end I showed with the queen giving check and the king preventing the king from coming up, the opponent king from coming up, is interesting because it's what we'll be using when we're playing with the rook instead of the queen. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about it. So how do we perform this rook and queen checkmate? You slowly want to push your opponent to the side of the board, and you want to take their king and get it to the edge as much as possible. You want to use your rook to cut off the enemy king. But when you cut off the enemy king, you need to bring your king to cut off the escape squares, because if you don't, the rook can only attack one file or one rank at a time. And if you don't use that correctly, essentially you're going to have the king just escaping. So you have to do it in a very specific way, and I'll show that in a second. Um, you have to use waiting moves when you're giving checkmate with the rook and the king. It's okay to waste a move with the rook to force this enemy king into a worse position. Unlike with the queen or unlike with two pieces, you only have one all right piece worth 5 points. Remember, the king itself is also worth 4 points in active fighting power. So you need to use your king very strategically so that you can really use both pieces to deliver checkmate. First, I'm just gonna do the checkmate incorrectly and just show you what I mean. Let's say I move my rook out. Okay, I've trapped the rook. I'll trap it more. Okay, they moved there. Now with the queen, I would just move here. Let me check them. Let me track them. Okay, I can't go here. Let's go back. Okay, they go there. Maybe let's come out. All right, let's go here. Okay, let's go here. Let's give them check. They come back out. Notice how we're actually 8 moves later, we've actually gone nowhere with this position because we're not following any strategy. So how do we give checkmate with the rook and the king? Okay, to give checkmate with the rook and the king, first thing, we need to cut off the king. So let's cut the king off this way. Notice how the king can never cross this line. Okay, but what now? You can't actually just move your rook here because then they'll just come back out into the open. So now you have to use this king. And this is where the idea of opposition comes in handy. If you move the king here right now, and it was your move, once you give check, right? Once you give check, you will, your king, your opponent's king will be cut off. And because you have direct opposition with your king, you're attacking these three squares, so the king cannot move out. And so that's the fundamental idea. How do you get opposition with your king? And once you get opposition with your king, you use the rook to push it back one more row and then rinse and repeat. So we have, for example, in this position, we check the king. Or we give the king direct opposition. Now that raises the next problem. If we give the king direct opposition in this position, then they'll just move out of the way and same thing happens. So now, instead of doing this again, let's try it one more time, actually. Yeah, see? So they just do that and they get out of it. So we do it one more time. And now, to do this, we need to waste a move. I'm going to move my rook here and waste a move. And so actually they moved in, but let's say now they go here. You just give them, so if they go here, they're in direct opposition again, and now you can give them check and they'll be forced to move back. What if they go this way? Then you just follow them now. You follow them until they either go into the previous file or on the previous square. As soon as they go in the previous square, you have direct opposition and you can come here. Remember, at the end, they'll be forced to come to the previous square. So in this position, we move the rook here. Now they're attacking us. We can just defend with our rook. And then notice how I can't go here again because then they'll just come back. So I just waste another move. And now I follow their king. So let's follow their king all the way. And finally, they give up. And now we have direct opposition. And so we check them. They come here. Notice how I did not go over here directly because I know they would just get out of the way. I want to sort of shoulder or stay one square away from the king. And the reason for that is that way, if they ever go the other way, I'll just, give them opposition. Now, don't just follow them blindly because now they're attacking a rook. But this has a simple solution. We just move the rook all the way to the other side. But now they're back to this position. And if I go here, they'll escape this way. And so the solution to that is waste another move. And now we trail them again, trail them again. And finally, they have no choice but to come back, and it's checkmate. All right, let's do that checkmate one more time. Just because rook and king tends to be the hardest, but sometimes you can only be up a rook, right? Maybe your opponent sacrifices their rook for your last pawn, and so you need to know how to do this. So we can, in this position, move our king maybe up, right? And let's go here. So notice how the first few moves, you just need to set stuff up. And now we go here. So this time we're going to give them checkmate along this rank. Come here. And then I move my king closer. And I move my rook out of the way. And now I just shoulder and follow their king. They come back. And I give, remember my king is attacking these squares. And once I move my king there, my rook there, I'll be checkmating them. All right. So that's how we do the rook and the king checkmate. Remember, the key idea is even though you have such a big advantage, you need to use both pieces actively. And your king, essentially, you need to make it so that it's acting like a rook or a heavy piece. And the strategy is just a more advanced and nuanced version of the lawnmower. Okay, let's look at some pretty tricky positions. We're going to be looking at essentially something called the Lucena position. And so the Lucena position is something that when we're playing with, we have a rook and a pawn, and we have to use that rook and the pawn to sort of win the position. Now, the problem is usually these rook pawn endgames are very complex. There are whole books written just about rook and pawn endgames. But when you're dealing with rook and pawn endgames, some positions are winnable and some are not. So even if you're up a pawn, you need to know when it's like something you can win and when it's something that you cannot win. In a Lucena position, you have an extra pawn that is not a rook pawn. The pawn is on the 7th, or if you were for black, from black's perspective, it's on the 2nd rank. Your king is on the queening square, right? So you can see that position right here. Your rook is cut off by the enemy square by at least one file, right? So if the king is already somewhere here or something, you can't really do much. But he's cut off from the enemy file by at least one file. And your enemy king is on the file on the other side of your pawn. So in this case, you just need to find a way to get your king out of the way. And once you get your king out of the way, you can promote. Problem is, how do you do that? And so what you do is you check your enemy's king, push them out of the way. So let's say they go here. Bring your king to the 4th rank or your rook to the 4th rank. And then bring your king out slowly to the 7th rank. And if you're checked by an enemy rook, you can bring it out here. And if they check you, for example, again, then you go here. Then they'll check you again. You come out. And now they can't check you again because first of all, if you just move the king out of the way, they might take your pawn, right? Or it'll be back to them checking you. But since you have this rook on this fourth rank, you can block with the rook and you've created a bridge. And so this is a very complex idea that I just shared, but this is how you would be able to win such a position. Nobody expects you to understand the Lucina position the first time uh, you are playing chess or the first time you're looking at endgames, but it's an interesting position about how complex these rook endgames can get because rooks move in a very methodical way, right? So there's a lot of strategy to it. So first, we're going to take our king and we're going to check them. Let's say they come right here. Now they're closer to the king, but actually you can just play this. And their own rook prevents you, but their own king prevents them from checking you. And so in this position, you would just promote and at least win their rook. And hey, we just looked at how to give checkmate when you're up a rook. So their king moves away. We move our rook out as this bridge. Their king come closer, king e7. And now they start checking. If they don't check, we're about to promote. So now they start checking. We move our king here. They check again. They have no other option. Otherwise, we're promoting. And let's say they move something like this. If they move something like this, you just move your king rook here. They go back, and then you're gonna promote on the next move. Or more commonly, maybe they'll check you another time. Maybe they'll say, "Hey, I don't believe you. I'm gonna check you." You bring it out. I'm gonna check you again. And if you go back, they'll just come here and do the same thing. But what you have to do is you have to play this move. You block, the bridge has been built, and next move you'll promote. By the way, they can also play a move like Rook D2, trying to trap you, right? Because if you play Rook F, if you just play something like this right here, trying to play your rook here in the way, they can actually they can take your pawn because now if you take, they'll just take your rook. And so actually they just defend it to a draw. And so what you have to play in this position is rook f6 check, they move, and then rook c4, so that their king is not attacking your rook. Okay. So that right there is a Lucina position. Very complex. We just looked at one example and some of the common caveats, but sometimes there are other caveats that exist. And so in this case, when you're up the pawn, if you're in this very specific position, which actually occurs a lot more than you think, because many times rooks are left and there's just one pawn difference left, then that's how you get out of it. And so here we can see another example of getting out of the Lucina position. All right, now we have the Philidor position. Philidor position, this time you're down a pawn, but you find a way to draw. And so it's a drawing technique, and it happens when you're down a pawn. Your enemy has a pawn which is about 3 squares from queening. So in this case, white has this pawn right here, which hasn't quite queened yet, but it's 3 squares from queening. And because it's 3 squares from queening, you should cut off this king from the third rank, because if the white king can't get closer, as you saw in the Lucina, you need to make sure the white king is there to be able to actually see through the checkmate. But if you cut off the king in a very strategic way, you can use this rook to pester the white king from behind and just keep on giving checks. And the only way to stop checks from this rook would be to bring the king closer to the rook, but that would mean it's away from the pawn, and so then you can capture the pawn. Remember, you're down a pawn, all you're trying to do is find a way to draw. Okay, so how do we do this? Obviously, black is down. Let's say we just play some random move like rook f7. Then they'll play this, and all of a sudden, next move, they'll check us, move us down, and then the king comes here or here, and the game will be over very quickly. So instead, you have to play rook h6. You prevent the white king from coming closer. They give you check, sure, doesn't matter. They come here, doesn't matter, you just waste a move if they're wasting a move, right? You don't have to do anything. The white king cannot come closer because that's when the danger happens. Now, eventually, once let's say they waste a couple more moves, it doesn't matter. The only actual option they have is to push the pawn forward to make progress. And to do something like this means now they've committed to this file. And now what you do is you go immediately all the way back. And this pawn could have been used as a shield for the white king from all the checks, but now there is no more shield. Now, let's say they play something like this and try to come closer. You just check and check. You just check them to oblivion. Let's say they come here, check them again, come here, check them again. Let's say they try to come closer, immediately you capture. So they actually have no option here. Maybe they'll try something like this to get out of the check, but this is why you need to know all your endgames because even if they block, you take, they take, you go here, they go here. And this is actually a forced draw because remember, we just have to make sure we get direct opposition. And then once we come here, they can't move their king out because then you'll take the pawn. And so they'll go something like here. And in this position, it's stalemate because you can't take the pawn, you're not in check, and you have no squares to move to. And so here we see another example of the Philidor position. All right, so let's look at some very complex strategies in chess. These are very complex that sometimes even grandmasters have trouble with. The first one is this idea of triangulation. And triangulation is this idea that many times in a chess position, you're playing against your opponent, and in a king, usually in a king-king endgame, right? King and pawn endgame, the game would be like we just saw in this last position, right? When we were looking at this position right here, all the way at the end, this is basically only a draw for black because it's white to move. Let's say we could have found a way to make it black to move in this position. Then if black has to move, they have to move out of the way, and white king comes here, and then they'll promote on the next move. So many times, if you can switch whose move it is, using some strategic strategy called triangulation, you can actually switch the result of the game. Basically in king and pawn endgames, sometimes in other positions, but usually king and pawn endgames because remember, kings can only block each other and the pawn moves are always binding. One king can move on three adjacent squares, basically in the shape of a triangle. So this white king, usually the king with more freedom can do this, while the black king might be forced to only stick to a few different squares, two squares to be exact. And so while they're switching between the two squares, you're switching between the three squares. And you come back to that same position, except it's your opponent's move. Let's take a look at a few examples of this. So in this position, if we go something like here, they'll just block us. And if we play something like this, they'll just go here. If we move away, they'll capture, and then the rook pawn is a draw. And if they go here, it's stalemate. And so when we have something like this, there's not really much that can be done. And this is a draw at the end of the day. Okay, so instead of pushing immediately, white says, hey, I want this to be your move so that whatever you play after that, I will get the opposition and I will follow whatever you do. So we play king c4. They move something like this because notice how the second we go here and the second they move here, we'll go here, we'll get opposition. They'll move back and then we can go in and just capture this pawn, for example. They go here, we waste another move. Remember, still can't go here. So that's the thing with triangulation, that your opponent is only stuck to two squares. And so then we do this, and we, in this position, have now made it black's move. Now, regardless of what black does, like for example, if they go here, we now get forced opposition. They move back, and now we come into this B6 square. And so now if we go here, they move, and with two pawns, it would be an easy win for white. And white just can push this pawn. And now he's not forced to defend it because he has another pawn to move, and white would win. And so that's one example of how triangulation could potentially work. Let's look at another example of triangulation. We play king d2. So notice how if we go something like this immediately, they'll just do this, and we never actually win the pawn. And so the position gets pretty tricky. If we do something like this, they push the pawn. If they push the pawn, obviously we win the pawn immediately. But let's say they play something like this. Now you can block and you get the opposition. And so after this, you would just be able to win the pawn. So the key idea is we don't actually take this pawn because if you take the pawn, it gets very tricky because king e5, king d3, and they'll take your other pawns while you're taking these pawns. But it still happens to actually work for white in this position. But we block, and now if they were to come, let's say, closer, we would be taking with oppositions. So this idea of opposition is strong because it prevents your opponent from coming in. And so in this way, we actually just have a pass pawn. And notice how we don't even need it to promote because we can just go ahead and capture the other pawns while they have this idea of an outside pawn that they're worried about. All right. Let's look at our last concept of the day, zugzwang. So zugzwang is a position where the player, usually when it's your move, it's a good thing. You can get out of the attack. But a zugzwang where is a position where a player is forced to make a move that worsens their material or worsens their position, and it's forced, right? Regardless of the move they play, their position gets worse. So you usually want to, in the end game, try to put your opponent in some sort of zugzwang so that they have to make a bad move and then they lose. And remember, this usually happens in king and pawn endgames because remember, a lot of these rook positions, bishop positions we were looking at, it's so easy to waste a move. So you'll never be forced to make an actually bad move. Maybe not the optimal move, but you won't be forced to make a move that makes you lose. Now, there are many different types of zugzwang. Let's look at a few examples. But usually when you're dealing with zugzwang, you will be able to depending on whose move it is, it might be possible that whoever's move it is actually loses. And so that's a two-way zugzwang. But let's look at a common example of zugzwang, something we've already seen. In this position, it's white to move. And so if we give check like this, we will let the black king escape. And so what we need to do is we need to move the king here. Or I mean, if we move the rook here, that doesn't do much either. So what we actually need to do in this position is we're trying to checkmate our opponent in two moves. So usually you can move the rook here and cut off the king. But here, what we can do is we can move the rook here. And if we move the rook here, the black king is forced to go here, giving us direct opposition. And then we can check with the rook, and that would be checkmate. And so all of a sudden, in two moves, we've checkmated them. Another example right here, white's in a very constrained position. We need to make it so that any move that they possibly make will lead to zugzwang in the position. And so then the question arises, how can we use zugzwang to force checkmate, right? Because right now the material is technically equal. Is there anything we can do to force zugzwang in this position? And actually, there is. Notice that there's this knight that can move and this queen. So if we move this rook all the way to the end of the board, this knight is pinned, these pawns are stuck, this rook is pinned, and this king is stuck. And so only the queen can move to this sad square, after which we can just capture. And now we just checkmate with the queen. So notice how even though it's equal, and that was a very rare type of zugzwang, but a position like that can lead to a position where you're winning really quickly. Remember the general idea. When you don't know what to do, general ideas come in. You want to stay with opposition. So we're going to make sure we have opposition in this position. Now they move out of the way. And now we can come closer and we take this pawn. and we come here. And this is this idea of zugzwang. If we move something like this, they'll just take. But if we give them opposition, their king is forced to move out of the way, and that allows us to capture this pawn, right? So the many times you want to put your opponent in a zugzwang, and now we would just be simply able to promote. We have two pawns. It doesn't really matter what way we do it with two pawns, because the strategy matters a lot less. Okay, here's an interesting example. This is an endgame composition by a player named Goldberg, and it was published in 1931. And the idea is you want to checkmate your opponent in 4 moves. How do we checkmate our opponent in 4 moves? And that would mean that we need to create some sort of a zugzwang in this position. So take a minute, see if you can see through this. Obviously, this is a very hard example to enter class with, but this is something that we'll discuss just to see, okay, how is this going in terms of general strategy? Okay, so obviously very tricky. Uh, if you were thinking something along the lines of, we want to capture this bishop, this knight in some way without trading, right? Because remember, just a bishop and a king versus your opponent, even if you're up a bishop, is not enough to checkmate. You need to somehow have both bishops to checkmate them, right? So that you can cover both types of squares for the king. So we need to get this king out of the way and this bishop out of the way. One way we can do this, let's move the bishop to a square like this, where it's threatening to go here and here. Now the king goes in the corner, and we could try to win this piece, but if they do that, that just ends up being a draw. So what do we have to do? Let's give the king check. And now we can't just have the king keep on moving back and forth. We need this bishop to move out of the way. And so we move this bishop right here, blocking all the squares for the king. The knight's already pinned, and then the bishop is forced to move out of the way. And because the bishop's forced to move out of the way, this knight can actually be taken with our bishop, and that's actually checkmate. So very cool example of how something like zugzwang can work in a position like this. All right, so the last thing I'm going to end with, if you haven't already, make sure to get a copy of our book, Becoming a Chess Master, and to get a free copy of the book right after the stream ends, just comment about your favorite part of the class, and 3 random winners will get a free copy of Becoming a Chess Master. Our next class will be our last class, and in that class, we'll discuss how we can, how you should improve your chess and how you can sort of learn and take everything we've taken from our class and feature some sort of an online tournament. Remember, you can always find our homework on the Puzzler on chesspupils.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share this course. Thanks, everyone.